Greetings and welcome to Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the American Society of Naval Engineers podcast. I am your host, Stephen Phillips. In this podcast, we talk a little and learn a lot about naval engineering while inspiring the next generation of STEM professionals. Today, I'm joined by Captain Richard Hepburn, U.S. Navy retired, to discuss his book, History of American Navy Battleship Shipyards and Industrial Base, Lessons Learned for Restoring Today's Navy. Captain Rick Hepburn is a United States Naval Academy graduate with a Bachelor of Science in Ocean Engineering and a Master of Science in Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering and a Naval Engineering degree from MIT. He is past president of the American Shipbuilding Suppliers Association and the American Society of Naval Engineers. He is the chairman and co-founder of Hepburn and Sons, LLC. His first book, History of American Naval Dry Docks, Key Ingredient to a Maritime Power, was featured on the History Channel. Rick, thank you for joining me on the podcast. I look forward to this discussion.
Well, thanks, Stephen, for welcoming me on your show. As a lifelong naval engineer, it's a pleasure to talk about my favorite subjects, warship design and construction, and the shipyards and the industry that made them possible. I have found that history is a magnificent treasure trove of lessons that naval engineers must be made aware of. We so often perpetuate mistakes of the past. We need to stop, learn, and incorporate hard-learned lessons or become victims of these lessons again. I want to thank you for supporting the American Society of Naval Engineers, which is a curricular society since 1888, supporting the United States Navy to make sure our naval engineers are given the tools to keep our Navy many technical steps ahead of our adversaries.
Rick, what was the inspiration to write History of American Navy Battleships?
Well, following up on my book, History of American Navy Ships of the Line, Lessons for the Navy Today, that was published in 2021, I followed my grandfather's naval career that took him literally from the ship of the line Vermont to the battleships, where they also took on the names of states. My grandfather served on 5 of the early battleships, including Nevada, before he retired in 1922. I worked on 2 of the last battleships to be in service, the New Jersey and Missouri. As I got into the story, I found what I thought were profound facts and lessons regarding battleship design and construction that are relevant today for the U.S. Navy to consider.
And how would you define a battleship?
Of course, battleships were constantly changing from 1888 all the way through 1944. And the first ones had a displacement on the order of what would be called a frigate today. But generally, they were the largest non-aircraft carrier combatant ships in the U.S. Navy inventory, capital ships, and always were named after states, except for one of the 73 named battleships, just like the ships of the line in the early 1800s. They also had the highest caliber guns and the most armor.
When were the first battleships built and why?
Well, the 13th November 1885, the battleship Richelieu was delivered to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, from the United Kingdom. The United States at the time had no warship that could go up against it. The U.S. Navy was still suffering from the post-Civil War doldrums. Representative Hillary A. Hebert, chairman of the House Naval Affairs Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, became alarmed and stated, "If all this old Navy of ours were drawn up in the battle array in mid-ocean and confronted by the Richelieu, it is doubtful whether a single vessel bearing the American flag will get into port." To specifically answer the Richelieu threat, the first 2 armored battleships, the USS Maine and USS Texas, were both authorized by an act of Congress on 3 August 1886. This was during President Grover Cleveland's first term under Secretary of the Navy William C. Whitney, 1885 to 1889. So that would have been when ASNE started too, right then.
Amazing. So as you said, the first 2 battleships were Maine and Texas. There were features in these ships that held on to the age of sail traditions. I find these paradigm shifts and when they occur interesting. As an example, the helm was still at the stern. And similarly, there's other elements that, while modern for the time, differ from the modern Iowa class, for example. So please talk about the design of these ships.
The Maine and the Texas had similar designs to the Richelieu, with offset from center lines called en echelon main batteries. In other words, the turrets were not center line, but on to the side. These locations were held over designs from the side guns on ships in line, but left the ships extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. Other features of Maine included her helm steering wheel, like you mentioned, located on the stern of the ship. Another holdover from the sailing warship designs. Maine and Texas had different designers and was basically a comparison of foreign design to a U.S. design. The Maine was a design from the U.K., and Texas was a U.S. design. Both ships were authorized by Congress on the 3rd of August, 1886. Maine, of course, met her untimely death in Havana Harbor on 15 February 1898.
These early battleship classes, they only had a few ships in each class. In some cases, only one ship. For example, the original Iowa BB4 was a single ship class. Are there advantages to building a ship class with only a few hulls?
U.S. Navy ship designs have always been about not keeping up with the Joneses, but staying ahead of the Joneses. Navies that don't end up on the bottom. Two things count in warship construction: capability and numbers. Between 1893 and 1905, battleship displacement went from 11,410 long tons on Iowa to 16,000 long tons, where the length went from 362 feet 5 inches to 456 feet 4 inches, and the beam went from 72 feet 3 inches up to 76 feet 10 inches, and the speed went from 16 knots to 18 knots. The increased dimensions and speed, increased stability, endurance, and combat capability. 21 ships were delivered during this period. A few hulls in a class keep ship designers busy, enabling near-term improvements driven by lessons learned in the World Navy competition.
Important to this discussion, of course, are the shipyards that built the battleships. Where were the battleships built and by whom?
During the same period, 1893 to 1905, 8 shipyards were involved in battleship construction on both coasts. 6 of the shipyards were new to building battleships post-Iowa. The importance of building on the West Coast emerged as a lesson from the Spanish-American War in 1898. Having 8 different shipyards on both coasts in 8 different states, not only was it of strategic importance, it offered political advantages as well when the Navy and the executive branch were garnering budget support from Congress. These 8 shipyards were located in Pennsylvania, California, Virginia, Washington, Maine, Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey. I'll keep going here. Overall, there were 73 named battleships. 11 shipyards built or were designed to build these ships. They included the Cramp Yard up in Philadelphia, Union Iron Works out in San Francisco, Newport News in Virginia, Moran in Seattle, BIW up in Massachusetts, Fore River in Massachusetts, and BIW in Maine, Fore River in Massachusetts, New York Navy Yard, of course, New York, and New York Shipbuilding, which actually was in Camden, New Jersey, Mare Island Navy Yard in California, Norfolk Navy Yard in Virginia, and the Philadelphia Navy Yard, of course, in Pennsylvania. And of the 73, 45 were in private shipyards and 28 in public yards. And the public yards being U.S. Naval Shipyards, or Navy Yards, as they were called.
Rick, let's take a moment and talk about your grandfather, Commander Joseph Daniels. He was a battleship sailor. So tell us, what did he do in his career?
My grandfather joined the Navy at 17 and first served on a 22-gun sloop of the line, the Portsmouth, in 1891. 45 years earlier, this same ship captured the Presidio from Mexico in San Francisco and ran up the Stars and Stripes the first time out there. As mentioned, he later served on the 74-gun ship line Vermont, which at the time was a training ship in Brooklyn. They decommissioned Vermont in 1901, having to give way for the battleships to take the state names. She was one of the 9 ships in line Congress authorized after the War of 1812. The new Vermont BB-20 launched at Four Rivers Shipyard just 4 years later in 1905. My grandfather was a Mustang and earned his commission about 1903 after coming up through the ranks as a gunner's mate. He served on the Wisconsin BB-9 as a gunner in 1900. He then served on the Kentucky BB-6 and Alabama BB-8 in 1904. On Alabama, as an ensign, he commanded the Ford 13-inch gun turret. In 1910, he served as the aft 12-inch gun turret officer on Minnesota BB-22. From 1915 to 1916, he was the first chief engineer of Nevada BB-36 when it finished construction at the Four Rivers Shipyard in Massachusetts. By the way, that was the first oil-fired battleship, went from coal to oil right there. He went on to being Admiral Sims' aide during World War I and also served as the aide to the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, similar name. They actually got each other's mail mixed up. He retired from the Navy at Newport, Rhode Island, 1922. My mother was born the next year, 1923, in Jamestown, Rhode Island. Nevada BB-36 was in Dry Dock 1 at Long Beach Naval Shipyard at Terminal Island, California, on the 2nd of December, 1945, after World War II, right after. This is significant for me, as here's my grandfather's battleship he served on in 1916, about 29 years earlier. And then the ship's then in Dry Dock 1 at Long Beach, and I operated that dock as a docking officer about 36 years later, kind of halfway between. But I have a picture of that battleship and my dry dock, so that's kind of fun. And I was a docking officer at the time at Long Beach Naval Shipyard. At that time, Nevada was being painted target red in preparation for being ground zero for the atomic testing at the Bikini Atoll in 1946. She was subjected to both an air burst and an underwater burst and did not sink. It's something we can hold against the Air Force. Hey, you can nuke our battleships, but doesn't really do anything. She was towed to Pearl Harbor for examination and soon thereafter was sunk off Oahu, Hawaii. Actually, we learned a lot about radiation and they were hot, so they had to sink the ship. But they didn't sink, at least in Nevada didn't.
That is amazing. What was the Great White Fleet and what battleship classes were included?
The Great White Fleet involved 18 battleships, BB-5 through BB-22. They included all the Kearsarge, Illinois, Maine, Virginia, and Connecticut class battleships, except the New Hampshire BB-25. The fleet did not include the smaller and less capable Mississippi class. All the hulls were painted white, except for golden gilt work on the bows. They actually put gold on the bows at that time. The fleet was sent off by President Theodore Roosevelt on the 16th of December, 1907, and they went around the world, ending the cruise on 22 February, 1909.
As more battleships were built and more shipyards constructed them, were there innovations in design and assembly?
Industrialists from the railroad and bridge construction industry, and that was the Industrial Revolution about 1880. They were involved in the creation of the private shipyards, such as what Henry Morse did. Morse created the New York Shipbuilding Corporation in 1899 at Camden, New Jersey, across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. It was originally supposed to be in Staten Island. That's why they took the name, the New York Shipbuilding Corporation, but I don't know, financial, whatever the problem was, they ended up in Camden. Still keeping the original name, like I mentioned. As an experienced bridge builder, he laid down 4 fundamental principles to make his shipyard state of the art. Remember, this is 1899. He used bridge builder practice of fabricating steel from mold loft templates. He used prefabrication of large structural assemblies and routing of material through the yard in an uninterrupted course without backhauling anything. So it just went one direction. He had the installation of an overhead crane system of the traveling type that would effectively serve every part of the yard and the ways. And he housed the principal shops in the yard and 5 building ways under a continuous roof structure. So even in bad winter weather, they could keep working. That's a lot of these things here, these 4 points are used today by modern shipyards. New York Shipbuilding built 9 battleships and stayed in business until 1967 after building a nuclear cruiser, I think it was the Truxtun, and nuclear submarines. By the way, if you look at that spot today, right across, it's near where the New Jersey is up there. You can hardly tell there was a shipyard there. It's a park, I believe. During World War I, the shipyard needed so many shipyard workers, a whole community was created called York Ship, named after the shipyard. If you actually go to that spot in Camden, New Jersey, come off the water just to the east, you'll see an area that looks like a circular residential area. It looks like a target. All the street names are after ships. And there was about 36,000 employees, and they needed housing. And so the government and the shipyard worked together and built a neighborhood. And those people could live there, work there, go to church there, go to stores there, and walk to the shipyard. I think there's a lesson there. If you want employees, you better build them a place to live. This community was one of the first scientifically designed neighborhoods using a circular design with roads named after ships. This was very innovative approach for providing a community and housing for employees within walking distance of the yard. And that's a lesson that should be considered today because everyone is saying they don't have enough employees. This neighborhood, like I said, can be seen on Google Maps. Investors such as Andrew Mellon made the shipyard possible. He invested in it. Part of the theme of this book I wrote is the amazing contribution of industrialists such as Morse, investors such as Mellon. So you think of Carnegie Mellon and that university, and the inventors such as Thomas Edison. Think of GE and propulsion motors. And another investor, J.P. Morgan, who invested in GE, as well as Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and U.S. Steel, all critical players in making battleships a reality. Another big player was Charles Schwab, who helped create Bethlehem Steel. He actually went from U.S. Steel and created Bethlehem Steel, which was vital for steel fabrication, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania up there, and also this massive machine shop they had, and they built the turrets for the battleships. In fact, the big, huge turrets that the 3 big 16-inch guns go in the Missouri, they were built there at Bethlehem Steel. Another shipyard was established by Collis P. Huntington. You kind of know the name Huntington Ingalls. Huntington Ingalls Newport News came about due to Newport News being the end of a coal railhead. I think it still is. The other end of the rail line was near Huntington, West Virginia. I wonder where they got that name for the town in West Virginia. Newport News Shipyard tied with the New York Navy Yard for the most battleships built. Each of those yards, Newport News being a private yard, New York Navy Yard being a public yard, each built 15 battleships. This yard is one of only 2 shipyards out of 11 that built battleships that still build ships for the Navy today. The other one is Bath Iron Works, Bath, Maine.
Rick, let's talk about the South Carolina class, BB-26. How was this class unique?
The Navy evidently tried to make an economic move in 1904 and had Cramp Shipyard in Philadelphia build the next 2 battleships. That was the Mississippi class with only 2 ships in that class, the Mississippi and Idaho. That was BB-23 and BB-24. The Mississippi class was smaller, slower than the Connecticut class, 3,000 tons less in displacement, 74 feet shorter, and 1 knot less in speed. Well, let's see how that worked out for the Navy. Both ships were sold off early to Greece in July 1914, and both were sunk immediately by the Nazi Germany in Athens in 1941. So that there was a little mistake there in the battleship. However, the next class, the South Carolina class, the Navy abandoned the smaller version of the battleship and went directly back to the 16,000 ton displacement, added 3+ feet of length to that of the Connecticut class, and added a half knot of speed up to 18.5 knots. The 2 South Carolina class battleships built were the South Carolina BB-26 built at Cramp and Michigan BB-27 built at New York Shipbuilding across the river.
So then South Carolina was followed by 6 more classes of 2 ships each. How was the Navy able to do this?
I think this is one of the most important points in this whole book because I looked at this and go, wow, if we can only do that today. This next period in U.S. naval battleship construction history was extraordinary. 7 classes of battleships: South Carolina, Delaware, Florida, Wyoming, New York, Nevada, Pennsylvania. That's the name of the classes. 14 ships total had their keels laid between 1906 and 1914. This occurred at 5 different shipyards. So 5 yards building 14 ships. And this happened, the keels were laid within an 8-year period. Keel laying to launch was 9. There were only 2 ships built for each class with major non-trivial changes, including displacement, how much a ship weighs, going from 16,000 tons up to 31,400. The length went from 452 to 608. The beam went from 80 feet to 97 and went from 2 screws, 2 shafts to 4. Fuel went from coal to black oil. Speed went from 18.5 to 21 knots. Engines went from triple expansion engines to geared turbines. The crew went from 869 to 915, and the guns, from 8 12-inch to 12 14-inch guns. The shipyards were cramped. They're in Philadelphia, Newport News, Fall River, the New York Navy Yard, and New York Shipbuilding. How was that possible? My opinion is that they had a large core group of engineers and draftsmen that were kept busy and directed directly by the Navy. So they're either contractors or government employees, but they were working directly for the Navy. And once they completed one design, they learned from that design and incorporated more change and directly went into the next design with no gaps. So they just kept, I mean, it's important to keep a shipyard employees working on the same job over and over and over because they get better. There's a learning curve. Same with engineers. You can't have a 10-year gap. You're going to have no learning curve. So they must have had a tremendous learning curve and not much personnel change because they didn't have time. Each ship was awarded to 2 shipyards. So you have one class, they award it to 2 yards at the same time. And then the associated keel laying at each of the 2 shipyards was usually very close in time to each other, within a month or 2. And the launches were about a year and a half later at each yard. So you had about 2 launches a year over this 9-year period, about 8 to 9 years. By awarding 2 yards at a time, the Navy benefited by parallel shipbuilding timelines. Might have been a sole source shipyard selection. They just picked 2 and issued the contract. And for each 2 ships, as the awards were split among the 5 yards, awarding them, some yards got 2 ships, some got 4 over the 9-year period at each yard. 5 of these ships ended up at Pearl Harbor in that fateful day, 7 December 1941. So these ships were kind of necessary. Texas, one of these 14 ships, and survives today as a museum. We'll talk about that, I think, in a minute. Each ship class had to have model testing completed to determine hull resistance and powering. This effort was led by Rear Admiral David Taylor, like David Taylor Model Base. He was very active in those times. He was the chief constructor and chief of the Bureau of Construction, so he was engaged. Naval constructors, which engineering duty officers used to be called naval constructors, still called naval constructors in the Royal Navy, or other, and they were also naval officers, let alone naval constructors, and they were dedicated to ship design and construction. And they were a part of the management of this incredible effort, gaining incredible experience in a short amount of time.
Amazing. Yes, indeed. I have to ask about USS Texas. It's the oldest U.S. Navy battleship that the American public can visit. So, yeah, please expand and talk about this ship for a minute.
I think recently they showed a picture of her in dry dock getting refurbished down near Galveston, Texas. And Texas BB-35 was a New York class battleship. Her keel was laid 17 April 1911 at Newport News Shipyard. She launched 18 May 1912. She was not at Pearl Harbor, but she was over at D-Day, but she ended up back over at Iwo Jima. And she's now a museum ship, like I said, near Galveston, and she's the oldest surviving battleship. You can see some of those 12-inch guns on her.
As you suggested, many of these ships were in Pearl Harbor. The Nevada class and the Pennsylvania class were both present. I suspect most listeners know of the fate of USS Arizona, of course, which is a sister ship of Pennsylvania. But what happened to the other ships that were there?
Well, as was mentioned, Nevada BB-36 survived 2 atomic weapon tests. Maybe Pearl Harbor wasn't her toughest day, but that's still a pretty tough day for her. And she was later sunk off Oahu 8 July 1948. The Oklahoma was sunk at Pearl Harbor. They did raise her. I think that was probably political. They ended up not reactivating her. She was still lost. Pennsylvania BB-38 survived Pearl Harbor and being attacked while in Braddock 1 at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. She was attacked again and torpedoed at Okinawa after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On 12 August 1945, she was torpedoed there and it tore a 30-foot hole into her. And she was able to be docked, though, out there in Guam in an advanced space sectional dry dock the Navy had out there. She ended up heading out, and she was involved after the war in the Bikini Atoll testing, and so she was eventually sunk at Kwajalein on 10 February 1948. At the keel laying of Arizona, everybody knows the Arizona story, but I did not know this. At the keel laying of Arizona BB-39 at the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Brooklyn there, Franklin Delano Roosevelt attended as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was there for the keel laying. A young boy held his finger during the ceremony. The boy was the son of a naval constructor in the yard. I thought it was his nephew or some, just some child of some naval. He gets up here. His name was Henry Williams Jr. He ended up joining the Navy and was on Arizona when it was bombed on 7 December 1941. He survived. So he saw up close the birth and death of this great ship.
Now we go into the missile age. Terrier missiles were put on USS Mississippi. What impact did this have for combat systems moving forward?
Well, most people don't know there was a battleship converted to carry missiles, and that was the Mississippi, what was BB-41. I didn't know this. I said, wow, because later we put Tomahawks like on the Missouri and the Iowa class later. But she had the first missiles, so they actually changed her designation from BB to AG. So she was an auxiliary guided missile ship, but really she was the first BBG. And she had Terrier launchers installed on the Phantom, and they did fire them. And I was alive. I was born in 54. This happened in my lifetime.
Amazing. The Navy experimented with electric drive for some of its battleships. How is this different from the traditional steam turbine propulsion, and why did it not remain as a viable shipbuilding approach?
Well, this revolutionary change to New Mexico BB-40 was the shift to an electric drive propulsion system. And the decision to shift to electric drive occurred during construction. During construction, they changed from turbines to electric drive. And it could be done because it was done at a Navy Yard. That's a good reason to have a Navy Yard, because you can do wild changes like this without, can you imagine a contract change anywhere else? That was done there. And while this was a heavier drive system installation than those of the two sister ships that did not get electric drive, the New Mexico proved more economical, flexible, and provided better maneuverability. And turbo-electric power was abandoned only because of the post-World War I Naval Arms Treaty, the Washington Naval Conference, that made it vital to save weight. Geared turbines used in the mechanical drive system were far lighter. So that's why it happened. Even though the ones that were cut during the Washington Naval Conference, they were supposed to get it.
Rick, will you share what happened during the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 and 1922?
This was a total tragedy, and it had repercussions down the road. There was consequences to this decision. So 6 South Dakota class battleships, BB-49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 6 ships, all had their keels laid in 1920 into 1921. However, the construction of all 6 battleships was halted, with the ships on the ways and the hull scrapped due to the Washington Naval Conference in 1921, 1922. The purpose of the conference was to limit a naval arms race, reducing capital ship tonnage. I think they were thinking Japan that would slow them down. All construction on these 6 ships was stopped on 8 February 1922, and this was an enormous mistake by the United States, as construction of battleships did not resume until 1937. Think of that, 15 years later. And 6 additional battleships in the U.S. inventory, they might come in handy, but right after 7 December 1941. And you think of the carnage to the U.S. Navy in 1941 and 42, Iron Bottom Sound, and it would have helped to have more battleships.
Would you talk about the emergence of the 16-inch gun?
Well, with the Washington Naval Conference stopping construction of the battleships on 8 February 1922, the Washington Gun Factory production of 16-inch guns also went idle. So that was another repercussion of that conference. But they did reemerge later, obviously, for the Iowa class and earlier battleships. There was actually one 18-inch gun that was produced and tested in 4 February 1942. People think, well, that's because the Yamato, the big Japanese battleship, had 18-inch guns. We actually didn't know that till later. So this gun was taken down to Dahlgren, and I have a place down there at Colonial Beach that I can hear the guns. I can just imagine the sound of this thing. 114 shots were fired from this gun at Dahlgren, Virginia, and the last shot was fired 7 November 1957. You can actually go see that gun today. If you can get on the base down there, go look at the 18-inch gun.
Rick,
Yeah.
I understand that you have 6 battleship lessons for today's Navy. Will you share those with the Talk a Little, Learn a Lot audience, please?
See, you know what's so great about writing your own book is you can put your own opinions in the book, which I really enjoy doing. So I write about history because I kind of stay away from today's things because he knows sensitivities. But history, there's so much there to learn. And I was so amazed looking back at what we actually did some 100-some years ago. And you think of these engineers designing all those ships, all those 7 class of battleships, one after another, with huge changes, the massive amount of calculations that they did. Did they have a slide rule? I don't even know. How did they just hand tabulated everything? So pretty amazing. But the big thing is, and the reason I had to design so many ships, you think of the Richelieu, the first battleship that we were faced with, could have sunk our whole Navy. You better keep alert, and you better stay ahead of potential adversary capabilities. So this is not a static problem. This is a dynamic problem. The next one was you need to enable and encourage and facilitate American investors and industrialists to invest in American shipyards and industrial base. Here's an opinion, and we get a lot of foreign investment coming in our yards. Nothing wrong with that, but it'd really be great if we saw American investors get interested. And I think the only way to do that is the government, being the number one customer here, has got to have a backlog, has to guarantee work that they can see a return on investment of massive facility upgrades. I think they're trying to do that with the maritime industrial base and other things, but that is so important. Battleship technologies required American inventors. So here's 3. You got investors, industrialists, and inventors. The inventors need to keep America's Navy superior by implementing inventions. So things change fast. You've got to see new things. You've got to encourage inventors, and that's the whole R&D realm. So you got to fund R&D in order for them to be encouraged. You got a lot of scientists, engineers, PhDs. You got the universities. They want something to do, and they want to do something productive. So to channel their thoughts and talent into improving our Navy, I think is very, very important. I like Navy-controlled ship designs. That's a little controversial, but I really think that's important because the shipyards are great shipbuilders, but I think if the Navy controlled their design, they can deal with the churn of requirements as that happens, as new requirements pop in suddenly. If the Navy's controlling the design, is thrown in there, And then I think their job, in my view, as I was director of surface ship design, is to lower the risk of the program manager, give him something he can actually execute. Because if he has to be concerned about what's the state of the design, and he's fighting with an outside firm to get it to happen, that's only going to slow the process down. But you can control the schedule, the risk, and the costs if you control the design. And also, battleships, it's a great example of how to develop the needed experienced engineers. Like I said, if you keep these folks busy, you're going to get people want to go and be a naval architect in college. You're going to see fun stuff. They get a battleship popping out the other end. People are going to want to go to school, become naval architects, marine engineers, and all the other engineering, electrical, mechanical, structural, even all the the combat systems side of it, with the people making missiles and launchers and software. That's going to encourage them to get in our business and not go off and do other things that are probably less important for our country. So there's a bit of patriotism, but it's got to be interesting, and it's got to be new, and it's got to be having a consequence that's going to help our country.
Well, thank you, Captain Richard Hepburn, U.S. Navy retired, for taking this time to discuss history of American Navy battleship shipyards and industrial base. I hope we can welcome you back in the future to Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the podcast of the American Society of Naval Engineers.
Thanks again, Stephen, for the opportunity to talk about these great ships and the many lessons learned. It was an American success story with many contributors across our nation, inspiring and a roadmap for how to accomplish such a feat in the future.